Loud recordings. Ooh, keep saying that. All right, here we go. All right. Welcome, everyone. We are just waiting to get started. My name is Ed Kaplan. If you have any tech issues at all, go ahead and feel free to put them in the chat. Specifically, choose my name from the list where it asks who you want to send the chat to. Just find me there. I should be at the top of the list. But so far, so good today. Hopefully, everybody is having a wonderful day. And we'll get started as soon as they get started in the sanctuary. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello? Wonder if I'm just trying to make sure they got it on online feed too now. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Ben. I'm excited to introduce our speaker this morning, Christy Vines. Christy is the CEO of Ideos, an organization that she founded with the goal of advancing empathy-based reconciliation, culture change, and community transformation in the hyper-polarized culture that we find ourselves in today. Her organization is a resource for those looking to build unity, break down the barriers that divide us, and engage meaningfully in public life as faithful followers of Jesus Christ. With a background in peacemaking and conflict transformation in global and religious context, Christy has traveled the world looking for solutions to some of the world's greatest conflicts. She has found that empathy is that solution. The ministry and teaching of Scripture exemplify how empathy is critical in allowing us to cross lines of difference and love our neighbors. Christy and her organization envision a future where dignity, experiences, and perspectives of all people are included in efforts to solve our greatest challenges. And her research and experience shows how empathy is that vital first step. Will you please join me in welcoming Christy Vines?
Thank you, Ben. I'm actually going to ask that if you're here, you move to the front. One, then I can see you because I've got really bright lights right here. And two, so we feel like a community rather than scattered guests all around. I'm going to start, first of all, I was telling a couple of people, including Sandra, that after she spoke, first of all, she teed me up perfectly, but second of all, I felt like I could just go home because she kind of had said everything that needed to be said. It was kind of a mic drop moment. But hopefully I add a little bit of something to what Sandra teed up. As Ben shared, the work that we do is on empathy. I actually call it the spiritual practice of empathy because I do think that empathy is ultimately exemplified and modeled in the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. And so I would love to say that we're coming up with something revolutionary, some new idea that I came up with, but really I'm just plagiarizing Christ's ministry. So today, I ultimately what I want to do in the time we have together is challenge you to think differently about what empathy is. I'm going to ask a question, and to be really honest, I'm going to go off script a lot. I had everything written down, the slides were perfect, and then I just felt like I was sitting there and God was just speaking to me and saying, nope, do this. Nope, do this. The other thing is I feel very, very uncomfortable a little bit because for 2.5 years I've been doing this kind of thing on Zoom, and so I keep looking down and going, I don't have sweats on the bottom half. I've not held a mic in almost probably 3 years, so if I seem a little bit like off my game, just blame it on the fact that I had to put on regular pants today. But ultimately, what I want to do is ask a question. If you had to define empathy in one sentence, how would you do that? Or what have you heard the definition of empathy is? Shout it out.
Coming alongside.
Okay. Say that. Oh, I haven't heard that one. That's good. Crawling into the heart of another. Crawling into the heart of another. Yes, that is what you hear the most. Empathy is trying to walk in somebody else's shoes. Now, if you have to try to imagine what it is like to be in somebody else's shoes, what is the likelihood that you actually know what it is to be in that person's shoes? It's marginal, right? So I always say that Brene Brown did a tremendous job of making empathy cool again. And I love Brene Brown. But I always say I have to disagree with the way she defines empathy. Because I don't believe that you can actually truly know what it is to walk in somebody else's shoes unless you've been in their shoes. And then you really don't need empathy because you already know what it's like. You often hear that people are just empathetic or unempathetic, as if somehow you're born with it in your DNA or you just didn't get that gene. I actually believe that it's teachable, and I think today, hopefully, I'm going to prove that it's teachable, and it's something that can be practiced over and over. We just did a documentary film, which you'll see a clip of in a minute, and when people ask me, like, well, what is it that you actually do at IDEOS? And I say, well, to be honest, we're really not teaching anything that your parents didn't teach you, or your teacher didn't teach you, or your pastor didn't teach you. Ultimately, we're trying to charge a muscle that has atrophied in our culture. But you already know how to do it. I say it's kind of a lot like bowling. We let you bowl, and all I am is the bumpers. And I make sure that your ball doesn't like fly into the lane next door or hit your bowling partner behind you. But ultimately, you know how to throw the ball down the lane. And I just keep it from landing somewhere it's not supposed to land. So hopefully that's a little bit of what you experienced today. We're going to start with a clip, but before I do that, I want to do an exercise with you. And this is what God asked me to do. Our logo is a tree. And so people often ask, well, why a tree for IDEOS Institute? And I'm going to show you why. So close your eyes. Imagine that you are a famous journalist. And your assignment has been to travel to this unknown or very remote island where there was a colony of trees. So imagine yourself, eyes closed, flying over, landing on this remote island. Imagine what it's like to be on that island. You've never been there before. Imagine what it smells like, what it feels like. And you're joined by other journalists from all around the world. So imagine all of these journalists getting off planes and joining you on this island. Your job is to capture the essence of the last remaining tree that is on this island. It is a tree that has given oxygen life to this entire region. And it's infamous. And they have all died except for this last remaining one. It is huge. It's majestic. And it is the lifeblood of this region for centuries. And your job is to capture the essence of this tree and send that information back to the rest of your audience. So imagine everyone gathering before this tree. Imagine what it looks like. It is tall, it is broad. Its roots are large and gnarled, and they go way beneath the ground and spread outward for miles. The canopy is dark, but there's incredible sunlight bathing upon it. Your job is to take out your camera. So imagine yourself getting your camera ready. You are biasing your lens. You are focusing it, adjusting it. Think about what picture you want to take to send the message home about the importance and majesty of this tree. Are you standing back to get the entirety of it? Are you taking a picture of the incredible bark or root system? Are you getting the under canopy? Or are you getting the light bouncing off the leaves? Take your picture. Now I want you to hold that picture in your mind's eye and open your eyes. Does somebody want to describe their picture? This is the easiest part of the homework today, guys. What's the picture? Yes.
Well, I got the large tree and the beautiful bark. I managed to stand back enough that I got pretty much the whole tree, and I could smell it. So I think if I send the picture back, they'll have a fair idea of what that tree is like. Not perfect, because I don't think I can capture that whole tree.
Okay,
I don't know.
perfect.
I know I tried.
Who had a different picture? Yes. Okay. Different picture. Yes. Okay. So how many of you had a different picture? Raise your hand than what you've heard. I want you to think about this. Same tree, right? Your picture is different than other people's picture, but it's the same tree. If you only captured a leaf, it'd be the same tree. Most of you could never take a picture that spans the entirety of that tree. You couldn't get the roots under the ground if you were taking a picture of the top. You couldn't get a picture of the under canopy if you were taking a picture of the leaves and the light bouncing off it from the outside. But it's still the tree. But most of us assume if that tree is, name an issue, immigration, race, economic disparity, refugee issues, national security, name an issue. That issue is the tree. And you are looking at the tree, i.e. that issue, from your lens. However, somebody else may be looking at that exact same tree from the backside or from underneath, or they dug a tunnel underneath to get a picture of the roots. The problem is we assume that our lens can capture the entirety of an issue. And what I'm here to tell you is that empathy is what happens when you walk around to the other side of the tree and ask that journalist, lend me your picture. And you go to the other journalists who took a picture underneath the ground of the roots and say, lend me your picture. Because as journalists, we're gonna put these images together and truly capture the majesty, the breadth, the history, the life-giving of this tree. Because we need all of these pictures to truly understand and to communicate the essence of the tree back to those who will never have a chance to see it. That is empathy. So I want you to think about that, keep that in mind as you watch this clip from the documentary that we just produced, Dialogue Lab America.
My parents were immigrants, and they escaped Hungary during the Hungarian Revolution against the Russians. They were actually captured at one point and held at gunpoint. They were instructed to all sit down. And my father turned to all of the other people that were captured, and he said, don't sit down. And he defied. The reason was because when he was 14 years old, he and his family were taken to Auschwitz. And his entire family was cremated in the gas chambers, and he was the only survivor. And my father had a lot of PTSD.
The home I was raised in, because of that, was a home filled with some elements of anger, especially towards the idea of any sort of God. If there were a God, he could not have allowed the events that happened in the Holocaust or the horrible things we saw.
So my beliefs about the world started to really be shaped by that. And where, probably more so you are pro-life, I am pro-humanity. I would argue that this vehemence that, abortion is murder, it's this, that, and the other, and yet we just discard people who are living and breathing. And that's not a religious question or a moral question. That is a human question, and it's not about which God.
So I was raised in a Christian home, pretty academically intense. So by the time I was graduating high school, I was pretty sure I knew the answer to just about everything. And I was ready to fight about it because I knew how to explain my side, I knew how to pick apart the other side, and I was really good at it. As a Christian, I am fully right to life. Every human is created with a plan and a purpose by God. But one of the things I had to confront was 3 of my friends were sexually assaulted in the same year. And I was forced to deal with the question of what do I do with evil, but also issues like abortion. How do I talk to a girl who I am deeply, deeply connected with and figure out how to humanely work through that? And in her case, she had an abortion. I don't have all the answers, and the media does a really good job of convincing me I do. I was hit with the realization that what kind of matters is who's caring for that woman right now? Who's making sure that she never has to feel this way again? It's not always up to us to fully fix everything. It's up to us to care about the people involved.
I just want to sit for a minute if I can. I could just start crying listening, I came prepared that, we were going to be very, very polar opposite. But the empathy that you are expressing for humanity, regardless of who is the motivating force or what is the motivating force, and I'm very moved by that, and I'm very hopeful that your generation, that there will be more people like that. And I need a Kleenex. My name is Jonathan. I realized from a political standpoint, it wasn't enough to just have kind of a red line of how you vote. You had to really understand that these were human beings and we had to humanize the experience. And this is the journey that I am now on.
So that we get more feedback and comments on that scene than any other point in the film, and I think you can see why. If you knew who Patricia was when she came in the door on day one, you could never have predicted that. She was angry. She was angry at religion. She was anti-religion. She was ready to fight. And sitting with Jonathan, as he shared, he's a strong believer, transformed her. But that was empathy. And she named it in a way, I mean, none of that was scripted. It wasn't planned. Only 2 crew members caught it. And so the reason why I show that is because she got to see a different side of Christianity through Jonathan's story. The complexity, the nuance, the vulnerability that comes from having a faith that often tells us we have all the answers. And then you see Jonathan wrestling honestly and authentically with that. And that was just one. I can't tell you how many moments there were in this film where as a crew and production team, we just marveled at God. And this was not intended to be a faith-based film. It actually premiered on January 5th for the National Day of Dialogue that we founded. But the reason why this is so important is because as believers and Christians, the way of empathy is a humbling journey. It's a hard journey, and we'll talk a little bit really quickly about what that means. So if you go to slide 3, this is really what we do at our core, is the way of empathy. This is what all of our work is based on. And it really is a call, as I say, to the church. The film, I say, is a love letter to the church, to model what I believe Christ has called us to be in a world where we are called to be the peacemakers and the reconcilers. But really the way of empathy is really, it's just an invitation to imagine new stories, to create meaning through dialogue, and then to actively do something about it. And so this is where the part about empathy being learned comes in. I wish I could say that it's some magical formula, but I'm just going to tell you how Jesus lived. So I'm going to take 5 minutes to run through 4 slides, and then I want to have kind of an open conversation about why this work is so hard. But the first slide, the first point is attention. And in a world of social media and technology and 25 million different media outlets and podcasts and still the good old radio and all of these things coming at us, all this noise coming at us, it's sometimes very challenging to just pay attention to the things that God puts in front of us. But I believe that if you really are trying to live the life of empathy, if you're trying to live the life I think that God has called us to be, of a believer called to transform the places and spaces where he puts us, you have to be doing this first. But often what we do is we pay attention to ourselves and our own experience and our own reality, and then we try, as Sandra said, to step into somebody else's, trying to place ourselves in their shoes, and haven't been paying attention to their lived experience at all. I know that my formative Christian experience happened in a very conservative evangelical church, largely white. We were about 10,000 people, and my husband had been the first African American ever on staff. And I grew up Catholic, So I had no context for what kind of the American evangelical church experience was like. And I also come from a very liberal family. My mother was a professor of social work. I had an aunt that was a professor of sociology. Come from a very, very diverse family. I had no context for this. And I remember just railing at God, at my husband. Why in the world would you have us here? But one of the things I got to do is I got to pay attention to a very different experience in America. And that was what it was like to be part of the majority church, the majority culture. I had no idea. And so I got to pay attention, and I really believe that the reason why God called me to this work is because I, through no background or reasoning of my own, I have a lot of stories in my head. And I have a lot of perspectives and a lot of lenses to see through. And so this work is very natural to me. I also grew up a prolific reader, so I have thousands of character stories in my head as well. But you have to do this. But I was told as the church, nope, we have all the answers. We have it right. Just preach the word, stay on message, do your apologetics, all will be good in the world. So I really challenge, especially Christians who come from that same place, that there is nothing wrong with paying attention to the world that is very different than you. It is, to me, the essence of evangelism and the essence of discipleship, which I don't believe you can do truly if you don't care about the lived experience of people who are different than us. So that's the first one, attention. The next one, again, Sandra couldn't have teed this up from we did not practice this, is proximity. To understand the evangelical church in America, God put me in the middle of the evangelical church in America. I was in a Southern Baptist church with a pastor who was the vice president of the Southern Baptist Convention Executive Committee. I couldn't have been more Southern Baptist. I could not have been more centered within the evangelical experience if I had tried. And it was interesting because so often we hear about the lived experience of the marginalized, the oppressed, the minority voices. Well, I was already all of that. My family background is, my mother's side is purely immigrant. My grandmother is Irish, first generation here in the US. My grandfather was West African from Cape Verde, first generation in the US. African and Irish woman get married. You can only imagine what that was like. Had to leave the East Coast, come to LA, and could not live anywhere but in a Black community. So my grandmother, Irish grandmother, ends up in Watts. Catholic through and through. I was raised literally on the knee of Catholic priests and bishops and cardinals because my grandmother's life was dedicated to Catholicism. My dad's side of the family, very different. My grandfather, literally, his background was basically the product of slave and slave master. So my dad, who grew up in Alabama, had skin about my complexion or lighter, sandy blonde afro and hazel green eyes, and could not play with anybody in Alabama other than his family because of the paper bag test. And if you know anything about the paper bag test back then, if you were light-skinned, you could not associate, befriend, associate with anyone that was darker than a paper bag. And so that literally in the South left my dad to play with his siblings. And so I had all these formative experiences, right? So I'm proximal to stories and experiences well beyond my own. But then God puts me in the middle of a very white, conservative, evangelical world, and I got to learn what it was like to be them. So this work is very natural to me. I love stories, I love experiences, I love being challenged, and I realize that not many people have that background. So I use this, or I include this because God, Jesus Christ himself, was as proximal as it gets, right? He's sitting in heaven, and God says, no, son, you must go and be proximal with the sinners and the unclean, the unwashed. I need you to be proximal. So I always say, if Jesus can step away from heaven, and let's be honest, the United States is not heaven, who are we to say, ooh, I don't want to step out of my little safe community and go over the other side of the tracks and be with those people? To me, it's exactly what God's called us to do. Step across the line and be proximal with people, created in his image, valued and loved deeply by him. And then once you're proximal, and once you get real comfy, we have humility. And one of the things I have learned the most about doing this work is that when you get proximal to the experiences of other people, I've been really fortunate to travel the world. I have sat with religious leaders from many different faiths, most of whom came to us pretty much begging for help. They were oppressed, they were imprisoned, their governments were treating them horribly. I've worked on issues of terrorism. And I can't tell you how getting out of your comfort zone quickly humbles you when you hear those stories. The one incredible thing I tell people, especially who haven't traveled or who have been largely in very homogenous environments, is one of the greatest gifts of my life has been that I've been proximal with the suffering, with the oppressed, with the marginalized, and experienced their utmost incredible joy in those moments. And so it's, I come back with those stories. When I hear about their plight in the news, I'm moved because I'm incredibly connected to them. And so when you get proximal, you realize, one, how little you know, how very much in a bubble we live in the United States, in our own communities, and how much richness and beauty and incredible lived experiences that hopefully add to our own. And so I always come back, I would come back from those trips incredibly humbled. And then, as a result, I just want to do something. So I got to spend some time in Myanmar. One of the most formative moments probably of my entire life, other than having children, and literally got to sit in front of tens of religious leaders, tribal leaders, in particular from the Muslim faith, who were largely in concentration camps, asking for us to go back to our State Department and get help for them. Got to travel the country with one of the leading Buddhist monks and really experience what Myanmar truly, truly looked like under military rule. Largely Buddhist country, and so the Buddhist faith and religion was the religious practice, and citizenship was denied most Muslims. I also got to sit with what was called the Face of Buddhist Terror on the cover of Time, with a coalition of other religious leaders from around the world, many who themselves were Muslim, and hear a Buddhist monk in a whisper talk about how they were teaching young, Buddhist children who had been given over to the Buddhist religion to be raised and to kill Muslims, and the propaganda that was there. And so when I heard last year about the incredible violence and uprisings that was happening, it took me right back there. And I couldn't not want to do something to help. And so the great thing about empathy is, when we're asked to sacrifice as believers, that happens when you've done the three things that, the three aspects, those first 3 points. When you've paid attention, when you've been proximal, when you've been humbled, this is the result. And I believe that this is what God calls us to every single day, that the life of the believer is a life of sacrifice that happens only when you have this outpouring of empathy. And so for I don't know how many of you have kind of stayed up with the debate. You know, everything is politicized these days. There's a whole debate happening in the church about the sin of empathy. Desiring God blog has put things out, and now there's like this back and forth war, Christianity Today then responded, and so there's been this war over empathy, which I don't understand because I'm like, but that's really just Jesus. So why are we fighting about this? But the great thing is, being somebody who tries to practice empathy, I said, let me try to understand the perspective of those who are anti-empathy. And it's really interesting what happens when you try to understand somebody and you start reading and you start understanding their background and you understand where they're coming from. And I realized fear compels many of them who are recognizing and seeing so many young people walk away from the faith. And they are trying to hold on and witness and hold on to a gospel and an understanding of Christianity that saved them. So no longer am I angry, now I understand. And so now I can have a conversation, and now I can be in dialogue, and now I can actually truly respond, not out of hate, not out of anger, not out of a desire to debate or defend empathy or Jesus, because he doesn't need my defense, but to listen, understand, and engage with them on a truly human level that says, because you think differently than me, because you have a different experience, because you have a different background, because you understand Christianity differently than I do, I get to learn, I get to grow, I get to enrich, I get to be a journalist who is asking the other journalist, what did you see on the backside of the tree? What did you see in the root system that I didn't see? What was your experience being at the very top of the tree in a hammock and looking down? Because I didn't get that experience. And then together as the body of Christ, together as a human race, we get to put all these images together to truly understand this incredibly complex, challenging, difficult space that is life, that is humanity, that is a global experience many of us will never understand, mostly because we've been blessed to live in the United States. And so I say that truly the life of empathy is the life of the believer, and it's a gift if you lean into it. Because no longer am I scared of other perspectives. I'm not scared for a Muslim to come and challenge me about Christianity. I'm not scared for a Buddhist to tell me what it is to worship Buddha. Because I get a chance now to share my faith and talk about what Jesus means to me. I don't have to defend it, because again, Jesus needs no defense. He's a far better defense attorney than I ever will be for Christianity. I don't have to debate the issue. I get the glorious benefit of listening and learning and then sharing in a reciprocal exchange that can only happen when you enter into a space curious enough to pay attention, proximal enough to learn, humble enough to recognize that we don't have all the answers, and sacrificial enough to offer what we have and the knowledge that we have to give somebody space to then share theirs. And then want to do something about their lived experience to help improve their lot in life. Because the one thing I always say as Christians is we love, especially in an era of political polarization, which I don't have to describe to any of you, but being in the middle of that work has been so incredibly interesting to me, because one thing I always say is, why is it that we love to say on one hand, this is not my home, I'm just passing through, but then we hold on to this world as if we are truly citizens here? I don't know the last time that you guys traveled to another country, but if you did, let me know how quickly you would have joined the military and fought and prepared to die for that country. I don't know that there are too many of us that would have done that. Why? Not our home, not our culture, not our fight. But so quickly as Christians, we want to grab onto these issues and go, oh, but this is what I'm willing to fight over. This is what I want to defend. But this isn't our home. You can't have it both ways. And so what I really call us all into, speaking to myself as well, is to really deeply embrace this idea of empathy. Because true transformation happens when you can actually do this work, build that muscle, so it just becomes a normative part of what you do every day. And then you get to have the incredible opportunity to enter into someone else's life and truly then be in a position to try to change it. So that's really the way of empathy. I think we have one more slide, which literally just talks about the work that we do and why. But ultimately, I often say, if you want to change the environment that we're in, the polarizing and divisive state that our nation and world is in, just become more empathetic. It's really that easy, because we can fight and debate it all day long. But one thing we all learn is that pendulum will swing back and somebody else will fight tomorrow and will win. And I'm not sure that's the world I want to live in. I just want to share Jesus and love on people. So I will end with this, and then if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And I also don't know I don't want to go over too much time, but one of the things I always love is, especially having, being the wife of a pastor, is people go, well, what's the scripture? Give me the scripture, biblical reference to what you do. And I go, yep, it's really, really simple. Love the Lord with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's it. Mic drop, we can all go home. That's it. Even God said that is the law above all law. Like, that is it. That is the totality of it. Yet we want to, let me find scripture, chapter and verse to say what it, no. Start with just the hardest thing that we are still challenged to do as believers on this earth, which is love your neighbor as yourself. And I would imagine that if you, as Sandra said, I don't have to use any other examples, if you were living on the other side of the geographic line that we call the United States, name a country that was being overrun with gangs or corruption or incredible economic failure, you'd want to be here too. I don't know any of us that would not be trying to climb walls to bring our children to safety, to prosperity, to opportunity. Love your neighbor as yourself. If you are a refugee who had lost their home and just needed a warm place to live with your children, who had just trekked hundreds of miles from the only place they've ever known, if that was you and your children, wouldn't you hope somebody would invite you in, clothe you, house you? If you were starving and your children hadn't eaten in a week, wouldn't you hope somebody would offer you some food? But wouldn't you steal it if they didn't? Love your neighbor as yourself. Oh, and by the way, following that, also love your enemy. So if you want to know what the way of empathy is, like I said, it's the way of Christ. It's the call that we all have to love your neighbor as yourself, and then love your enemy. So that's it. That's all I got. Questions? Or comments? Yes.
Thank you. I'm Ted, and when you mentioned the sort of war about empathy, desiring God. I just quickly looked on my phone and just scanned a little bit. But what's the objection that, like, how have you come to understand why white conservative evangelicalism, or some of them, are opposing empathy? And you know, the little bit I scanned, it's like, okay, well, compassion is this, and sympathy is this, and here's a translation of something that the NIV translated from, I think it's Hebrews, from sympathize to empathize.
Yep.
So tell me what you've learned.
Yes, yeah, it's fairly complex, and so I won't try to distill the entire debate here, but I'll kind of give you the high points as I understand it. One is, I think that there is a misunderstanding and misrepresentation of empathy. So I think that is the largest part of it, which is why we are working very hard to really challenge the status quo in terms of the way in which empathy is understood. And we really call it a strategic way of living and really living and engaging with the issues that we all come up against every day. So that's one, certainly a misunderstanding and misrepresentation of what empathy is. Also, interestingly enough, there is the misunderstanding, or maybe even just the erroneous idea, that as Christians, we are supposed to stay arm's distance from those who are hurting and kind of throw them a life raft so that we don't get corrupted by their belief systems, or by their practices, or how they live. And so I actually think that's heretical, to be truly honest. I also think that it is fear-based. I really do. I think that so much, and let's be honest, the word empathy has been so politicized over the last couple of years. And I remember when I was just starting to do this work, and I remember President Biden said, I'm going to be the empathy president. And I went, oh, Lord, you've just made my job 10 times harder. Because, empathy is now seen as a progressive liberal idea. And so I just think that this is just my belief, and I think the research really is bearing this out, but so much of the response of the evangelical church is fear-based. It's a loss of influence. It's the idea of a loss of power. It's the shifting sands of culture that makes us uncomfortable, especially when that's what you've grown up in and it's all you know. And so the unknown often brings fear. And so for me, I understand it. I understand. It's much like if you were just taken from your homeland and you were plopped in the middle of the United States and you're like, I have no idea what this is. Fear happens. Change brings fear for most people. Partially, we also live in a society in which change doesn't happen that often. And so we like to think of the United States as this very, kind of, it goes back to this idea of longing for the past, because the past is safe. It's comfortable. There's no scary unknown out there. And so I think a lot of it is grounded in that. And I think sadly, the church, both politically and even theologically, have kind of been caught up in that fear-based posture of losing something that, and to be honest, that a lot of Christians value deeply because it is so much a part of their own experience. And I understand that. And again, we're not taught to our culture, church-based and socially, as Americans, we don't particularly celebrate change well. And so I think a lot of it's grounded in just that human reality.
We have an online participant, Forrest, who wrote, can you describe how you approach the challenges of people's understanding of masculinity and embracing empathy?
Ooh. They want a sermon. No. So as somebody who's also done work in global women's empowerment work, this is very relevant because most religious contexts are very, very patriarchal, very much based in a masculine kind of power dynamic. Read the question to me again.
Can you describe how how you approach the challenges of people's understanding of masculinity and embracing empathy.
Okay. Let's just start with the simple fact that the masculine ideal is a part of almost every culture in modern times. Certainly, if you go back historically, that has not always been the case. Certainly, there have been societies and whole periods in history where the ideal of the feminine and of womanhood was actually the power dynamic in the culture. And so, even an understanding of scripture because it's been largely interpreted through a male lens, a patriarchal lens, you end up having this idea of masculinity and kind of the authority and position of men interpreted one way. I'll just leave it at that. I'm not here to debate whether that's right or wrong. I think scripturally, you could certainly understand a masculine or have a masculine context that is different from a more probably a more secular or even what some would call, which I can't stand, but progressive liberal understanding of Christianity. All of that being said, if that is the context in which you were raised, and that is the context of how you understand what it means to be a man. Same with a woman. If this is the context in which you were raised, it's how you understand what it is to be a woman. It's why when you go to the Middle East, especially having been someone in the US for which the idea of women, global women's empowerment often looks at cultures like the Middle East and Islam and says, oh my gosh, you oppressed women. And those women are like, no, leave me alone. I'm not oppressed, I'm good. I kind of like the hidden aspect of being behind the burqa or the hijab, because it's how we operate. We get to talk as women with no men around. We get to, have like side eye rolls and secret glances that nobody can see. So leave your Western culture there. I'm good with the way in which we understand femininity and masculinity. Now that's obviously a broad stroke, but empathy says, instead of demonizing, because it's different than your experience or different than how you see it, empathy would say, think about the context in which individuals were raised. It doesn't mean, and one thing I will say, if there's anything that I want you to walk away from this, is that empathy is not acceptance or approval. Doesn't mean I have to agree with you, doesn't mean I have to approve of or accept your belief system. Empathy simply means having the understanding of what's behind that belief system so that we can have a dialogue about it in a way in which I understand you. I understand where that's coming from. And it's also really helpful because I think in this dynamic that we're in now, especially when it comes to political polarization and these big social issues, it's just about a fight, right? It's a fight for who's right, who's wrong. It's how we engage most of the time on issues, is I'm gonna fight you over my perspective because I believe that if I fight you hard enough, I'll either win and you'll accept my perspective, or we will walk away from this a winner and loser. So it's a very binary kind of perspective, rather than I can enter into this space and have a dialogue with you. There's a good chance we're gonna walk away and I may not believe differently, you may not believe differently, and that's okay. But the longer I understand your perspective and where you're coming from and why you believe what you believe, it softens you. It's why stories are so powerful. In fact, we start our work with the story exchange, because you see what that does. Because Jonathan and Patricia, we could have just put them together and said, okay, debate pro-life, pro-choice. And it would have been a debate. At the end of the film, we actually have a dialogue with all 12 participants, which is fascinating and was very challenging at sometimes to moderate. But that would have been it would have been a very different experience had we not have done the story exchange in the beginning, because everybody then got to the dialogue with a better understanding of where people were coming from. And there's also a neuroscientific the neuroscience of telling somebody else's story in the first person actually changes the way in which you see not just that person, but people like that person. So it's why the story exchange, we have people tell the story as if they are that person, using I. But the great thing about all of this is that through empathy, so I'll diverge a little bit. The work that we do in dialogue is actually an empathetic form of dialogue called generative dialogue. And it's this understanding that when we come together in dialogue, rather than debating and defending, but truly seeking to understand, the goal should be to walk away with more knowledge and wisdom than we enter into it with, which is why it's generative. It generates more. And so the more curious you are about life, the more you lean into these experiences with this idea that I just want to learn. And we can walk away agreeing to disagree, but I know more, you know more, and we're better off for it. And so that's really, I think, what empathy does in these spaces. And then because we've softened, hopefully the dialogue gets to continue. Because I don't see you as an enemy. We're not at war with each other. This is no war of ideas, which is why I have a real big problem with the way in which we weaponize our faith, we weaponize scripture because we use terms like at war with the culture. We're not at war. You can't be at war with somebody and love someone. You can't be at war with the culture and then believe that somehow you can't completely have to destroy something in order to then build something back up. And so language is a huge part of it, but this is a very long-winded answer to that question. So hopefully somewhere in there I actually answered the question. But empathy is hard. It's just hard because we've been conditioned to fight to win. And we're at time. Thank you guys for listening. I hope this has been helpful. It is on YouTube. You just look up Dialogue Lab America.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. Thank you very much. This is always a hard time right before lunch because you realize after.
No, after lunch is always the hardest.
That's even worse. That's right.
Okay, we have lunch being served.